very eloquently and visually sold them both themselves and their topics so accurately, and I hope I don't need to encourage you to support further.
Inside Windsor Castle, the boxes keep arriving every single morning. Red leather, sealed, never late. 20 miles away, inside a quiet brick farmhouse called Wood Farm, the fire is already lit and nobody is waiting for a delivery. 2 homes, 1 marriage, over 70 years old, and split down the middle in a way the palace never explained out loud. For years, the public asked the same question in 100 different ways. Why did Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, spend so much of his retirement away from Queen Elizabeth II? Why did 2 of the most watched people on earth choose separate roofs after 7 decades together? Tabloids called it distance. Some called it something colder. Nobody inside the palace ever gave a straight answer. Then, Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, breaks her usual silence. She is not a royal who chases cameras or courts attention. She works. She rides. She speaks in short, blunt sentences and walks away before anyone can turn her words into a headline. But this time, when she is asked directly why her father chose Wood Farm over Windsor, she does not walk away. She answers. And the answer is not what anyone expects. Hi viewers, before we go any further, answer me this in the comments. If someone you loved for 70 years needed to disappear from the spotlight just to feel like themselves again, would you hold on tighter or would you finally let them go? Because that is the real question sitting underneath this story. Not scandal, not betrayal, something far heavier. The public built its own version of this marriage, brick by brick, out of paparazzi photos and half-finished tabloid captions. Separate houses became separate hearts. A quiet countryside retreat became proof of a broken bond. But Princess Anne watched this marriage from the inside, not from a long lens across a hedge. And what she saw looks nothing like what the newspapers printed. This was never a modern celebrity marriage, built on convenience and easy exits. This was a royal marriage, shaped under 60 years of protocol, duty, and silence most people never get to see. Prince Philip did not simply retire like other men his age. He stepped back from a machine that had run his entire adult life. Queen Elizabeth II did not simply stay behind. She stayed because the crown gave her no other option. Somewhere between those two truths is the real story Princess Anne finally agreed to tell. But the answer was not hidden in a scandal. It was hidden in 1952. Cameras wait outside Wood Farm for hours and get nothing. No wave, no statement, no return trip to Windsor before nightfall. For the photographers parked along that quiet Norfolk lane, silence becomes the story itself. That silence is exactly what turned a countryside cottage into a symbol of something broken. Reporters wrote about distance. Commentators speculated about coldness. A house that once meant peace for Prince Philip slowly turned, in print, into evidence of a marriage falling apart. But history rarely moves at the speed people want it to. Buckingham Palace confirmed in 2017 that Prince Philip, Duke of Edinburgh, would step back from public engagements from that autumn onward, and that Queen Elizabeth II fully supported the decision. That single-sourced fact should have settled the story. It did not. The public wanted romance to look simple. They wanted 2 elderly royals sitting by the same fire every night, forever, like something out of a greeting card. Royal life has never worked that way, and Princess Anne knows this better than almost anyone alive.
We're just spending £1 on doing it.
She grew up watching her mother open red boxes before breakfast and her father study weather reports before flying himself somewhere on duty. She did not grow up believing marriage inside the monarchy looked like marriage outside it. So when tabloids turned her father's retreat into proof of rejection, she reportedly found the entire narrative almost insulting to what she actually witnessed at home. Here is the detail most coverage skipped completely. While Prince Philip stepped back from public life in 2017, Queen Elizabeth II did not. She continued a full calendar of royal duties, official visits, and constitutional responsibilities that never paused for retirement, grief, or age. One partner in that marriage was allowed to close a door. The other one held a role with no door to close at all. That difference, quiet and procedural on paper, carried enormous unspoken emotional weight in real, everyday life. Wood Farm was never a rejection of Windsor. It was the only space left where a man in his 90s, who had spent 60 years walking 2 steps behind his wife in public, could finally walk at his own pace, in his own time, answering to no one. The public saw abandonment. Royal historians increasingly describe something closer to survival, and that reframing changes everything about what comes next, because the real cost of that arrangement was never paid by Prince Philip alone. It was shared, quietly, by the woman who could never fully join him in that peace, no matter how much she may have wanted to. The Queen had a role she could not resign from. Philip had finally found one door he could close. February 1952. A phone line crackles inside a lodge in Kenya, and the message that comes through ends one life and begins another. King George VI is dead. Elizabeth is now Queen. And somewhere in that lodge, Philip has to be the one who tells his wife her father is gone and her entire life has changed forever. Biographers have long described that moment as the true end of Philip's independence, not his wedding day in 1947, not his wife's coronation over a year later, but that single phone call in Kenya. Before that morning, Philip had a life that belonged to him. He served in the Royal Navy with real ambition, commanded ships, and built a career on merit rather than birth. Colleagues reportedly believed he had the talent to rise to the top of naval command. He had discipline, pride, and a future that existed independently of any royal title. Almost all of it stopped overnight. Once Elizabeth became queen, Philip did not simply support his wife from a distance. He became consort to the crown, a role with no formal constitutional power and little historical precedent for a man to occupy. Historians have documented his frustration in the years that followed, including the long-running dispute over the royal family's surname. Philip reportedly wanted his children to carry his name, but Winston Churchill's government insisted the House of Windsor would remain unchanged. Philip is said to have described himself in a moment of dark humor as the only man in the country not permitted to give his own children his name. That detail is not gossip. It is documented royal history repeated across multiple biographies of the period. This is the wound Princess Anne inherited secondhand. Not a villain, not a broken man. A father who gave up rank, ambition, and identity piece by piece the moment the crown passed to his wife. The part of this story people rarely focus on is what that surrender cost him day to day. Philip walked 2 steps behind Elizabeth at nearly every public event for the rest of his life, a visible symbol of exactly where royal protocol placed him. Commentators have noted the quiet weight built into a lifetime of formal second place, performed in public, over and over, for cameras that never stopped watching. None of this makes Queen Elizabeth II the villain of this story. She did not take Philip's naval career from him. She did not write the rules of precedence that put her 2 steps ahead of her own husband. The crown did that, decades before either one had any real choice in the matter, and decades later, the place where Philip finally recovered a piece of himself was not a palace at all. Princess Anne does not do interviews about her feelings. She has said on the record more than once that she finds the entire idea faintly ridiculous. So when she finally speaks about her parents' living arrangement, even in careful, guarded terms, royal watchers notice immediately because silence like hers rarely breaks by accident. She grew up inside a household most people only see from behind a velvet rope, boxes of state papers on the breakfast table, detectives outside every door, a mother who could not take a single day fully off duty, and a father who spent decades trying to build something that was still his own, inside a life that technically belonged to the crown. Anne watched both of those pressures up close, day after day, from inside the family, not from a printed profile in a magazine. She reportedly understood her mother's duty because she inherited a version of it herself, carrying one of the busiest official schedules in the entire royal family for decades, often without the headlines her brothers received. and she understood her father's need for independence because she shares his bluntness, his impatience with public performance, and his preference for doing rather than explaining. That rare combination makes her uniquely positioned to explain what outsiders got wrong for years. Royal commentators have long suggested that Anne served as a kind of emotional translator inside the family, someone who could see her mother's constitutional cage and her father's need to escape it, without treating either parent as the villain. She is not reported to have publicly blamed her mother for staying. She is not reported to have publicly blamed her father for needing distance. Both truths in her framing are said to have simply existed at the same time. That nuance rarely survives contact with tabloid headlines, which prefer a clean villain and a clean victim. Anne's understanding of her parents' marriage offers neither one. Her frustration, according to people close to the family speaking to royal reporters over the years, was never about her father's choices or her mother's duty. It was about a public narrative that turned a complicated, exhausting royal life into a simple story about a husband who left. Anne knew that was not what happened.
There were not many people who understood just how broad his interests were and how supportive he was of an astonishingly...
She watched her father stay married, stay loyal, and stay present at the events that mattered, while still needing somewhere the crown could not follow him. To understand why Prince Philip stepped back from the rhythm of palace life, the story has to go back further than Wood Farm. It has to go back to what palace life had already taken from him. There is no villain standing in a doorway in this story. No affair. No secret enemy. Just a calendar, printed a year in advance, that leaves almost no room for two people to simply exist together as husband and wife. That calendar is the real antagonist in this entire story, and it has outlived every single person who has ever tried to control it. Royal historians increasingly describe the monarchy itself as the true pressure point in Prince Philip's later years, not Queen Elizabeth II, not Princess Anne, and not Philip himself. The institution runs on public appearances, constitutional duty, and a level of scrutiny that turns even a quiet dinner into a potential headline. Love, inside that structure, gets scheduled. Family time gets logged. Even a private choice about where to sleep at night becomes public evidence, argued over by strangers who will never meet either person involved. Picture it like a slow, procedural thriller with no single culprit standing at the center of it. Closed doors that open on a fixed timetable. Official diaries planned months ahead, printed, filed, and rarely changed for anyone. Long palace corridors built for ceremony, not comfort, walked by the same handful of people thousands of times over a lifetime. Constitutional duty that cannot pause for grief, age, illness, or exhaustion, no matter how tired the person carrying it has become. And underneath all of it, the quiet, grinding reality of never fully owning your own time, year after year, decade after decade, until an entire life has quietly passed by inside someone else's schedule. This is also where the story stops being only about Prince Philip and starts being about the entire modern monarchy. King Charles III inherited the throne, and along with it, the same structural weight that shaped his parents' marriage. Reporting throughout his reign has described plans to reduce the number of working royals and shrink public costs tied to the monarchy, part of what commentators have widely called a slimmed-down model of royal life. Prince William, Prince of Wales, is already being discussed by royal correspondents as the future face of that smaller, more efficient, more carefully managed institution. Princess Anne remains, by most public counts of royal engagements, one of the hardest working members of the family, continuing the same relentless pace her mother once carried for decades without complaint. The question this raises goes far beyond one farmhouse in Norfolk. Can any modern royal family survive long-term if duty keeps consuming the private person underneath the title generation after generation without anyone ever pressing pause? Prince Philip found one way to answer that question personally, decades before Charles or William ever had to consider it for themselves. Then came Wood Farm. The public called it distance. Philip may have simply called it oxygen. Inside a farmhouse on the edge of the Sandringham estate, the phone almost never rings for state business. No red boxes on this table. No detail of foreign visits to review before breakfast. Just quiet rooms, a few old friends, and a pace of life that nobody watching from outside the gates ever expected from a man who once commanded ships. This is Wood Farm, and for years the public got the story wrong. Newspapers treated Prince Philip's retreat there as a retreat from something, from his marriage, from his family, from Windsor itself. But public reporting around his later years paints a very different picture, one built on rest rather than rejection. Friends and staff who spoke to royal reporters over the years described a quieter routine at Wood Farm, centered on reading, on carriage driving across the estate grounds, and on hosting a small circle of people he trusted completely, away from cameras, protocol, and the constant choreography of public life. None of that sounds like exile. It sounds like the opposite. For 65 years, Prince Philip had almost no room to simply exist without an audience. Every appearance, every trip, every public word had been shaped by protocol long before he ever opened his mouth. Wood Farm gave him something the palace never could, hours that belonged to nobody but him. Royal commentators have suggested that retirement, for someone who lived nearly his entire adult life inside constant public performance, has to look different than it does for anyone else. A quiet farmhouse is not a downgrade for a man who spent decades walking 2 steps behind cameras. It is the first real privacy he had been allowed in half a century. There is nothing explosive in that picture, only something quietly sad. An aging man who had spent decades being useful, visible, and controlled finally found a version of freedom, but only after almost everyone who might have shared it with him full time was gone from his daily life, or still chained to duties of their own. That single detail changes how this entire story should be read. Because the most painful truth in this whole arrangement was never that Philip needed peace. It was that Elizabeth could not fully join him in it. If this story is already changing how you see that marriage, hit subscribe and turn on notifications, because the next chapter holds the real turning point. And in the comments, tell someone else's story of a person who found peace late in life. It might inspire somebody who needs to hear it today. 2 houses stand 20 miles apart, and inside one of them, Queen Elizabeth II is still signing papers past sunset. Inside the other, Prince Philip has already gone to bed early, undisturbed, on his own schedule. For most of the world watching from outside, that image reads as a marriage running out of road. It is not. Here is the twist buried underneath this entire story. Princess Anne's real reveal is not that her parents' marriage broke apart. It is that love, at that level of the monarchy, was never going to look like love anywhere else. For most couples, retirement means finally sharing every hour of the day. Vacations together, slow mornings together, nowhere else to be. For Queen Elizabeth II and Prince Philip, retirement was never going to work that way, because only one of them was allowed to retire. Royal biographers have long debated whether Philip's stepping back was an act of independence or an act of surrender. But almost none of that debate blames Queen Elizabeth II for staying behind. Her role as sovereign was constitutional, not personal. She could not simply choose to spend her final years the way her husband did, because the crown itself does not resign, retire, or take a season off. That single fact reframes everything the tabloids got wrong for years. If the Queen truly loved Philip only as much as gossip columns implied, she likely would have resented Wood Farm, resisted it, or quietly pulled him back toward Windsor every chance she had. Public reporting shows the opposite happened. Buckingham Palace confirmed she fully supported his decision to step back from official duties in 2017. Support, not resentment. Permission, not punishment. Royal commentators have suggested that this may be the deepest form of love available inside an institution built on constant visibility, letting the person you love disappear from the spotlight, even if it means seeing less of them yourself. That is not a broken marriage. That is one partner protecting the last years of the other partner's freedom at real personal cost to herself. And that quiet, private sacrifice made by a woman the entire world assumed was simply cold or distant. is the real reason Princess Anne finally chose to speak. Because that same painful arrangement, duty on one side, freedom on the other, did not end with her parents. It echoes straight through the reign of King Charles III. If this reveal is landing for you, subscribe now and turn on notifications, because the next chapter follows that same pressure straight into the present day. Drop a comment below if you have ever loved someone enough to let them have space you could not have yourself. Somebody reading it might need to hear that today. King Charles III walks into a room, and the same red boxes are already waiting for him that once waited for his mother. Same daily briefings, same constitutional weight, handed down the moment she died, with no transition period and no time to adjust. The machine that shaped his parents' marriage did not retire when Queen Elizabeth II did. It simply changed hands. That inheritance is where this story stops being history and starts being current news. Reporting throughout Charles's reign has described real efforts to reduce the working size of the monarchy, sometimes called a slimmed-down model, focused on fewer senior royals carrying public duties and tighter public spending tied to royal life. Commentators have connected this shift directly to decades of pressure the family faced over cost, relevance, and workload, pressure that built up quietly for years long before Charles ever wore the crown. Prince William, Prince of Wales, now sits at the center of how that future gets built. Royal correspondents have widely discussed him as the face of a more modern, more efficient monarchy, one designed to demand less personal sacrifice from fewer people while still meeting public expectations. Whether that balance is actually possible remains an open question every royal reporter keeps circling back to. And then there is Princess Anne. By most public counts of royal engagements over recent years, she remains one of the hardest working members of the family, carrying a schedule that echoes the same relentless pace her mother once kept for 7 decades. Royal commentators have suggested that Anne represents continuity in its purest form, proof that the old model of constant duty still exists inside the family, even while the institution around her tries to modernize. That contrast says something the palace rarely states out loud. The monarchy is trying to demand less from its working members, while its most dependable working member keeps proving the old system can still function, at real personal cost to her. This is the same tension that once shaped her father's entire adult life. Only now it is playing out inside King Charles III's reign in real time, with the whole world watching for signs of who breaks first under the weight of it. The monarchy can survive scandal. Royal historians have long argued the harder question is whether it can survive exhaustion. Subscribe and turn on notifications if you want to catch the next chapter, because it puts every royal in this story on trial at once. Tell us in the comments which royal you think carries the heaviest weight today. Somebody else reading this might see their own family in the answer. Picture a courtroom with no judge, no jury, and no verdict that everyone can agree on. That is what this story becomes the moment people stop asking where Philip lived and start asking whether he was right to live there. Was his retreat to Wood Farm selfish? Was it necessary? Was it loving? Was it simply long overdue? Royal commentators have argued all 4 positions at different points over the years, and none of them fully wins the argument because the honest answer is layered, complicated, and not simple at all. It was necessary for him. After 65 years inside a role he never trained for and never fully chose, a man in his 90s finally claimed a small, quiet piece of life that belonged to nobody but himself, on his own terms, for the first time in decades. It was painful for the public image of the monarchy because distance photographs badly, and headlines rarely wait for nuance before printing a verdict. It was understandable for Princess Anne, who watched both parents pay a price the public never priced correctly, one in daily headlines, the other in daily silence. It was lonely for Queen Elizabeth II, whose duty never once paused long enough to let her fully follow her husband into that peace, no matter what she may have wanted for herself. And it was dangerous for the institution itself, because it proved something the palace never wanted proven in public. Even the most loyal, most disciplined royal servant the family ever had eventually reached a limit he could not push past any further. This is where the story stops being about scandal and starts being about regret. Regret for Philip, who gave up a career, a name, and decades of ordinary freedom before finally taking a small piece of it back. Regret for Elizabeth, who carried duty until her final year without complaint, in public at least. Regret for Anne, forced to watch both of her parents pay for a system neither of them built. And regret for every royal child since, who grows up watching duty sit at the family table like an uninvited guest nobody is allowed to ask to leave. By the end of this story, the real scandal was never where Prince Philip chose to live. It was how many decades he waited before finally choosing peace for himself. If this chapter hit you differently than the last one, subscribe and turn on notifications so you do not miss the ending. And in the comments, tell someone about a person in your own life who waited far too long to choose peace. Your story might be exactly what somebody else needs to read today. Two houses stand 20 miles apart one final time. Inside the palace, the queen is exactly where duty always kept her. Inside the farmhouse, Philip is exactly where peace finally found him. Nothing about that image has changed since chapter 1, but everything about what it means has changed completely. At the start of the story, that distance looked like proof of a marriage falling apart, two people who had simply run out of reasons to stay close. By the end, that same distance looks like something closer to mercy. Mercy that Elizabeth gave him by letting him go without a fight, without a headline, without ever once asking the public to understand why. History rarely grants that kind of quiet mercy to people trapped inside institutions built long before they were born, and even more rarely gets credit for offering it. Princess Anne, the Princess Royal, closes this story the way she has closed most conversations about her family throughout her life, with dignity instead of drama. She is not reported to have painted her father as a man who abandoned his marriage. She is not reported to have painted her mother as a woman who failed to hold on to him. Both of her parents, in her framing, simply paid a price the public never fully understood. Her mother paid by never once fully setting duty down, not for grief, not for age, not for love itself, until the very last year of her life. Her father paid earlier and differently, surrendering a naval career, a family name, and decades of ordinary privacy before finally reclaiming a small, quiet corner of it at Wood Farm with a few close friends, a bit of reading, and roads he could drive at his own pace. Neither sacrifice cancels out the other. Royal commentators have suggested that this may be the most honest definition of royal love available, two people accepting completely different costs for the same shared duty without ever publicly blaming each other for the price. That is not the scandal the headlines promised. It is something harder to sell and far more true. Prince Philip did not leave Queen Elizabeth II. He left the noise around her. If this story changed how you see that marriage, subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss the next one on this channel. And before you go, drop a comment about the moment this story shifted for you. Somebody scrolling past today might need exactly that story to feel less alone in their own.